The 10 yen coin sits on the edge of the cutting board because there is nowhere else to put it. The kitchen being the size of a large closet in the dashi apartment building where your family lives on the 4th floor of a block of identical floors inhabited by identical families eating, more or less, the same dinner at the same hour. The smell of soy and mirin rising through the concrete stairwell like a shared secret, like the evidence of a common life that nobody has formally agreed to but that everyone participates in without discussion. The way that neighborhoods participate in weather or noise, or the particular quality of a Sunday afternoon that is neither busy nor empty, but simply present, simply the texture of lives being lived in proximity without intimacy. The 10 yen coin is not symbolic. It is the budget. It is the remainder of this week's shokuhi, the food allowance that the household operates on with a precision that the word budget does not quite capture, because budget implies a plan that might be exceeded, and exceeding was not an option that the 1970s dashi kitchen entertained as a possibility. The shokuhi was the shokuhi. The cooking was the art of making the shokuhi produce a week of meals that the family ate with gratitude, and without the awareness that gratitude was the appropriate response, because the meals were not presented as products of economy, but as products of cooking. The economy being the invisible architecture behind the visible meal. The constraint that had produced, through years of creative necessity, a repertoire of dishes that no restaurant served and no cookbook documented, and that tasted, honored to the people who ate them, simply like dinner. The 1970s in Japan was the decade of the economic miracle's maturation, the decade when the miracle had been going long enough that people had begun to forget it was miraculous, to treat prosperity as a background condition rather than an achievement, to feel the first stirrings of the consumer desire that would fully bloom in the 1980s bubble years. But in the dashi kitchens of the working families, in the small apartments where the mother cooked on 2 gas burners with a refrigerator the size of a filing cabinet and a fish grill built into the range that doubled as an oven. Because there was no oven, the economic miracle was a thing that happened to other people's fathers, in other people's companies, producing other people's bonuses. In these kitchens, what the 10 yen coin on the cutting board was the reality, and the 25 recipes that follow are what the reality produced. The first is the dish that every family in every dashi building in every city in Japan made at least once a week, and that no one ever talked about outside the family because it was too ordinary to mention, the way you do not mention breathing. Tamagoyaki gohan, the plain rolled omelet over rice, made from 2 eggs and a small amount of sugar and soy and mirin, cooked in the rectangular tamagoyaki pan in 3 thin layers that were rolled over each other with the flat spatula in the motion that the mother had practiced for so long that she did it while holding a conversation about something else, her hands performing their rehearsed geometry while her attention was elsewhere. And the omelette emerging from this divided attention as perfect as it would have emerged from full concentration, because some skills become deeper than attention. It was cut into slices and fanned across the top of a bowl of rice with a pour of soy around the edge, and it was complete. It required nothing else. It was the dinner that 2 eggs and rice and the accumulated skill of a woman who had made it 100 times produced, and it tasted of all of those things simultaneously. The second forgotten recipe is the one that used the part of the chicken that the market sold cheapest, because the people who bought chicken in the modern mode wanted the breast and the thigh, and had not yet understood what the older generation had always known. Toriniku no motsu itame, the stir-fry of chicken giblets. Mice, the liver and the heart, and the gizzard that the butcher sold in small packages for almost nothing, stir-fried in a hot pan with the sliced green onion and the burdock shaved into thin diagonals, and a sauce of soy and mirin and sako, and a small amount of dubanjiang, the fermented chili paste that the 1970s kitchen had adopted from the Chinese cooking tradition and made its own, adding it with restraint to dishes that needed depth and heat rather than the broad flavor of the doubanjiang itself. The giblets were cleaned carefully, the liver cut away from any bile ducts that would have made it bitter, the heart split and the blood rinsed out, the gizzards peeled of their inner membrane and scored on the surface to allow the sauce to penetrate. All of this preliminary work taking 10 minutes and being the difference between a bitter, tough result and a result that was rich and tender and deeply flavored in the specific way that organ meat is deeply flavored, the way that says the body is receiving something it recognizes as essential. The third is the soup that cost almost nothing and fed the table as though it had cost considerably more. Tofu to wakame no miso shiru made from the dashi of the previous night's fish bones. The bones that had been cracked and simmered in fresh water for 20 minutes and strained, producing a broth that was technically free because it was the byproduct of the previous evening's meal. A broth that the modern cook pours down the drain without considering what it contains. Into this fishbone broth went the miso dissolved off the heat, a block of silken tofu cut roughly into cubes, a handful of dried wakame reconstituted in cold water for 3 minutes, and the result was a miso soup that tasted, because of the fishbone broth beneath it, richer and deeper than the standard dashi and miso version, richer and deeper for free, richer and deeper because the 10-yen coin on the cutting board had produced a discipline of use that the wealthy kitchen never needed to develop, and therefore never did. The fourth forgotten recipe is the one that the children of the Danchi generation remember with the most specific fondness, the fondness that attaches to flavors encountered before. The palate had learned to evaluate them critically, encountered simply as good as the taste of being fed by someone who loved you. Hayashi raisu made from scratch without the commercial roux block. Made instead from a sofrito of onions sweated in butter until translucent, and then cooked further until the edges began to caramelize. The cheapest cuts of beef added and browned. A tablespoon of flour stirred through the fat and the beef until it had toasted and taken on a faint nuttiness. Then water added slowly, and a tin of tomato and the soy sauce that was not in any European Hayashi recipe, but that belonged in the Japanese version as naturally as the beef. The whole thing simmered until the beef had given up its resistance, and the sauce had thickened and darkened and become the color of something that had been cooking for a long time, which it had. Poured over rice on the white oval plate, the plate that was only brought out for Hayashi raisu and nothing else. So the oval plate being the vessel for this specific meal, in the way that the small lacquer dish was the vessel for the pickled vegetable, each food having its correct container, and the correct container being part of the correct experience of the food. The fifth is the dish that the 1970s Danchi kitchen made from the outer leaves of the napa cabbage that the market sold at reduced price because they were the outer leaves, and therefore blemished and slightly wilted from the exposure they had sustained in the market stall. Hakusai no amazuzuk, the sweet vinegar pickle of napa cabbage, the outer leaves stripped from the head, washed and cut into rough squares and salted heavily, and left under a weight for 2 hours until they had expelled most of their moisture and collapsed to a fraction of their original volume. Then rinsed and squeezed dry and dressed with rice vinegar and sugar and a small amount of salt. The sweet-sour balance calibrated to the preference of the household, which in some households was more sour and in some more sweet, and in some precisely between the two, the calibration being one of the ways that an identical recipe became the specific possession of a specific family. The amazuzuk sat in the refrigerator and was eaten across 3 days alongside whatever the main meal was, and it improved on the second day, and on the third day was at its best. The outer leaves that the market had discounted having become, through the simple intervention of salt and vinegar and thyme, a condiment of real quality, a condiment that no one who ate it thought of as a product of economy. That was simply the pickle that went with dinner. The sixth forgotten recipe is the one that demonstrates most clearly the 1970s kitchen's capacity for transformation, for taking an ingredient at its least expensive and most overlooked, and producing from it something that surprised even the people eating it. Atsuage no dengaku, the grilled thick-fried tofu with miso glaze, the atsuage being the tofu that had been deep-fried until its exterior was firm and golden, and its interior remained soft and white. sold at the tofu shop or the market in blocks that were cheaper than regular tofu because they required extra processing and were therefore considered, by the logic of the market, to be the tofu for people who were going to do something further with them, which was precisely correct. The atsuage was cut into thick slices and placed in the fish grill or the hot pan and grilled until the exterior had heated through and the already fried surface had crisped further, and then the dengaku miso was applied. Red miso mixed with mirin and a small amount of sugar and the yolk of an egg, beaten to a smooth paste and spread over the surface of the hot tofu and returned to the heat. For the 60 seconds it took for the miso glaze to begin to bubble and caramelize at its edges, the sugar browning and the miso thickening and the kitchen filling with the smell of fermented soybean and caramel that is one of the oldest and most reliable pleasure signals that the Japanese kitchen produces. The seventh is the recipe that the households with access to a garden or the markets of early summer made from the vegetable that grew faster than anything else and produced more than anyone could eat in its season. Nasu no shigeaki, the eggplant halved lengthwise and scored in a crosshatch pattern on the cut surface and grilled cut side down in a pan with a small amount of sesame oil until the flesh had softened and collapsed, and the scored surface had caramelized against the hot pan, then topped with the same dengaku miso paste and grilled briefly until the miso had set and slightly charred at the highest points of the scored surface. Eggplant was the cheapest vegetable of the summer market. The shigeaki treatment was the alchemy that the cheap vegetable required, not to disguise what it was, but to make fully legible what it was. Sucker the high heat drawing out the eggplant's capacity for a smoky, soft, almost meat-like richness that the uncooked or gently cooked vegetable never reveals. The eighth forgotten recipe is the one that the 1970s kitchen made from the ingredients at the very back of the pantry, the things that had been bought in quantity when the price was right, and that now, weeks or months later, were available in abundance while everything fresh was scarce. Soybean and hijiki. No gomokuni, the many-ingredient simmered preparation of dried soybeans that had been soaking since the night before, and dried hijiki seaweed and carrot and abura age and lotus root. So all of it simmered together in a dashi of soy and mirin and sake until the liquid had been entirely absorbed and each ingredient had exchanged flavor with every other ingredient in the pot. And the result was a dense, dark, richly seasoned preparation that improved over 3 days in the refrigerator, and that could be eaten beside rice, or stirred through rice, or eaten cold directly from the container when the appetite was small and the need for something real was large. It was made on Sunday and eaten through Wednesday, a 4-day contribution from a single preparation that had taken 40 minutes of active attention and 3 hours of soaking, the economy of effort being as significant as the economy of cost. So the dashi kitchen having only so many hours in the evening, and those hours needing to produce results that extended beyond the evening. The ninth is the breakfast dinner, the meal that occupied the ambiguous territory between the morning and the evening in households where the distinction between meal types was less fixed than the cookbook assumed. Tamago tofu. No miso shiru, the miso soup that was also a complete meal, made from a dashi so good that it needed no embellishment, and a silken egg tofu that had been made at home by mixing beaten egg with warm dashi in a ratio of 1:2, and setting it in a small mold in the fish grill over low heat until it had just set. Trembling and pale, and tasting of the egg and the dashi simultaneously, of both things at once rather than either thing separately. The egg tofu was unmolded into the miso soup bowl, and the soup poured around it. The miso dissolved in dashi that had been made from the morning's kombu, and the whole thing was a meal of such simplicity and such completeness that the question of whether it was breakfast or dinner seemed irrelevant, the question having been designed for a world of greater abundance than the one in which it was being asked. The 10th forgotten recipe is the one that the family made on the day before payday, the day when the shokuhi had been used with such precision across the preceding 2 weeks that what remained in the pantry was not quite enough for any planned meal, but was more than enough for the meal that the empty pantry always produces in a kitchen that has learned to see the empty pantry. not as a failure, but as a creative prompt. The kakiage of miscellaneous things, the tempura fritter of whatever the vegetable drawer held at the end of its cycle, the half carrot and the remaining few centimeters of burdock, and the last of the green onion, and a small piece of lotus root, and whatever else the drawer produced when fully investigated, all of it cut into thin pieces and mixed into the loose tempura batter and fried in the oil that had been kept from the previous week's frying in the small tin beside the stove. Or the reused oil not a compromise, but a contribution. The accumulated flavor of previous fryings giving the fresh batter a depth that new oil never had. Eaten with a tentsuyu dipping broth made from the last of the dashi and the end of the mirin bottle and a careful pour of soy. Over the rice, that was the one ingredient the Danchi kitchen never ran out of, because running out of rice was the one condition that the household budget, however tight, was organized to prevent. The 11th is the dish that the children of the decade remember not as poverty food, but as the food they asked for, genuinely asked for, on their birthdays and on the evenings when they had been allowed to request the dinner. Nikumiso don, the spiced ground meat and miso over rice. 6. The cheapest ground pork available stir-fried in a hot pan until the fat had rendered, and the meat had browned, and the kitchen smelled of something the stomach recognized immediately as the prelude to something good. Then a generous spoonful of red miso stirred through the browned meat, and mirin and sake added, and the heat reduced, and the whole thing stirred continuously for 5 minutes while the miso cooked into the meat, and the meat absorbed the miso, and the two became a single, dark, intensely savory mass that was then piled over a bowl of rice and topped with a raw egg yolk placed in a small depression made in the center of the meat with the back of a spoon. The yolk broken at the table and stirred through the hot meat, coating everything in a richness that the ground pork and the miso alone had not quite achieved. The 40 yen of ground pork, a spoonful of miso, an egg, rice, 4 servings. The mathematics of the Danchi kitchen expressed as a dish that the children asked for on their birthdays. The 12th is the soup of the winter that had gone too long. Nira to tamago no kakitama jiru, the egg drop soup with garlic chives. The nira being the flat-leafed alliums that grew back faster than it could be cut from the pot on the kitchen windowsill, and that cost almost nothing at the market, and that provided, in each small bunch, more sulfur compounds and more beta-carotene, and more of the particular sharp, garlic-adjacent flavor that the winter diet needed than its price suggested was possible. The nira was cut into 3-centimeter lengths and added to the simmering dashi 30 seconds before the egg. The egg beaten and poured into the barely simmering soup in a thin, slow stream, while the soup was stirred in a gentle circular motion that coaxed the egg into long, pale ribbons rather than the solid clumps that a fast pour into a rapidly boiling liquid produces. The miso dissolved in at the end off the heat, the whole preparation taking 8 minutes from the cutting of the nira to the bowl on the table. The 13th forgotten recipe is the one that reveals most completely the 1970s Danchi kitchen's relationship with the tofu shop that was still, in most neighborhoods through most of the decade, a local producer selling fresh product made that morning from local soybeans. Okara no unohana. The cooked soybean pulp that the tofu shop gave away or sold for almost nothing because it was the byproduct of tofu production, and the tofu shop had more of it than it knew what to do with. Sautéed in sesame oil with carrot and burdock and abura age and shiitake, and dressed with soy and mirin and a little sugar into a preparation that was crumbly and moist and slightly sweet, and so thoroughly flavored by the things cooked with it that the okara itself, which had almost no flavor of its own, became the medium through which all those flavors were experienced simultaneously. Unohana was the budget dish that did not announce itself as a budget dish, that presented itself at the table as a side dish made from a specific and chosen ingredient rather than from the available and affordable one. Because the okara was not available and affordable in the way that desperation makes things available and affordable, but in the way that knowledge makes things available and affordable. The knowledge of where the value was that the market had not yet decided to charge full price for. The 14th is the one made from the fish that the fishmonger sold late in the afternoon at reduced price because it had not sold at morning price and would not keep another day. The fish whose variety changed depending on the day and the season and what had come in on the boats and what had not sold. The fish that the experienced dashi housewife arrived at the market at 4:30 to claim, the timing of this arrival being itself a form of kitchen knowledge. Like the knowledge that 4:30 was when the reductions appeared, and 4:40 was when the other experienced 4:30 housewives had already taken the best pieces. Whatever fish arrived home from this expedition was made into shio-yaki if it was fresh enough to be honored simply, or into nitsukao, simmered in soy and sake and mirin and ginger, if it needed the flavor support that braising provides, or into miso-yaki, marinated in a paste of miso and mirin for an hour and then grilled. The miso marinade performing its enzymatic work on the surface proteins of the fish during the marinating hour and producing, under the heat of the grill, a caramelized, intensely savory crust that made whatever fish was inside it taste like the best version of itself. That the 15th through 17th forgotten recipes follow the logic of the vegetable section of the Shotengai market on a Thursday afternoon, when the week's produce was at its most reduced and most varied, and the cook who could see the meal in the ingredient rather than the ingredient in the meal could assemble a dinner from 3 separate marked-down items that tasted as if it had been planned from the beginning. Satsumaimo no gohan, sweet potato rice, the sweet potato cut into rough cubes and cooked directly in the rice cooker with the rice and a little salt, and a small piece of kombu, the sweet potato softening as the rice cooked and releasing its sweetness into the surrounding grains. The finished rice being slightly sweeter and more golden than plain rice, and requiring no accompaniment beyond a bowl of miso soup and a pickled vegetable to be a complete and satisfying dinner for 4 people from 1 sweet potato and 2 cups of rice. Moyashi no namul, the bean sprout salad that the Korean-Japanese communities of the 1970s introduced to the broader dashi table and that spread through the apartment blocks with the speed of any genuinely good idea freely shared. The bean sprouts blanched for 30 seconds in boiling water and dressed while still warm with sesame oil and soy and a small amount of garlic and a scatter of toasted sesame seeds, the warmth of the sprouts opening them to the seasoning and allowing the garlic and the sesame to penetrate rather than coat. The result being a side dish of real quality from an ingredient that cost less than anything else in the vegetable section, and that the Western kitchen of the same era was using exclusively for chop suey. And kabocha no soboroni, the crumbled ground meat and winter squash simmered together in a sweet dashi. The small amount of ground meat distributed through the pot in loose, crumbled pieces rather than formed into any shape. Its purpose being not to be the meal, but to flavor the squash, to give the mild sweetness of the kabocha a savory counterpoint that made the dish feel more substantial than its meat content would suggest. The squash absorbing the flavor of the meat and the soy and the dashi, and becoming something unified and complete. The meat having accomplished, through its distribution and its dissolution into the broth, more than it would have accomplished if it had been presented as itself. The 18th forgotten recipe is the one that the families with the smallest shokuhi made on Sunday, the day when the budget's weekly accounting came due, and the calculation of what remained and what was needed produced the meal that the remainder required. Tofu no hambagu, the tofu hamburger, made from firm tofu pressed dry and crumbled together with a small amount of ground pork or chicken, the pork being present in a ratio of 1 part meat to 2 parts tofu. The tofu extending the meat rather than replacing it, bound together with a beaten egg and a tablespoon of potato starch and seasoned with soy and ginger, and a small amount of sesame oil, formed into oval patties and cooked in the pan in a film of oil until both sides had browned and the center had firmed. The sauce was made in the same pan after the patties had been removed, a combination of soy and mirin and sake, and a tablespoon of ketchup. The ketchup being the concession to the Western hamburger's reference point that gave the tofu hambagu its identity as a thing in dialogue with another tradition rather than simply an imitation of it. The dialogue producing something that was neither Japanese nor Western, but specifically dashi. Specifically the 1970s, specifically the cooking of a kitchen that had been exposed to outside influences and was incorporating them at the speed and in the manner that its resources allowed. The 19th is the breakfast that was also sometimes dinner in the households where the boundaries between meals were determined by appetite and availability rather than by the clock. Chikuwa no itsobi age. The fish cake tube coated in an ayanori seaweed batter and fried, made from the chikuwa that was the cheapest formed fish product in the market, and that the dashi kitchen used with a versatility that the ingredient itself, a cylinder of fish paste with a hollow center, did not obviously suggest but that the kitchen's necessity made apparent. Fried in batter for breakfast, simmered in oden broth for dinner, sliced and dressed with miso paste for a snack, stuffed with cucumber or cheese for the school bento. The aonori batter was the treatment that made the chikuwa most completely itself. The seaweed flavor complementing the fish flavor with the particular rightness of two things from the same general category of ocean-derived ingredients meeting in the same preparation and recognizing each other. There's the 20th is the recipe that the grandmother brought to the dashi kitchen from the farmhouse kitchen, and that survived the translation from the hearth to the gas range without losing the quality that had made it worth bringing. Nope jiru, the thickened root vegetable soup of the Niigata region. The daikon and carrot and taro and konjac simmered in dashi and seasoned with salt, and a small amount of soy, and then thickened at the end with potato starch dissolved in cold water, stirred in slowly so that the thickening was gradual and even, producing a soup that had the body of something much more substantial than its ingredients suggested. A soup that clung to the rice it was eaten with, and that warmed the body from the center out in the specific way that thickened soups warm. And the starch holding the heat longer than a thin soup held it, and releasing it slowly through the eating. The 21st through 23rd come in the voice of the school bento, the lunchbox that the 1970s dashi mother prepared every morning with ingredients that cost the minimum and produced the maximum in terms of the child's satisfaction at the lunch table, where the contents of every bento box were visible to every other child. And the social calculus of the lunch table was conducted in the currency of what the bento contained. Ume shiso gohan, the rice mixed with the dried shiso leaf and the flesh of the pickled plum, pink and fragrant and tart. The rice turned the faintest blush color by the contact with the plum, fragrant with the shiso, requiring nothing further to be a complete and beautiful bento rice. Dashimaki tamago, the thinner, more delicate version of the rolled omelet made with more dashi than the standard tamagoyaki so that the egg was softer and more trembling, and released dashi when cut. A tamagoyaki of such refinement that it took longer to master than any other single component of the bento, but that, once mastered, elevated the entire box around it. And kinpira gobo, the burdock and carrot stir-fry that kept perfectly at room temperature for the 6 hours between making and eating, and that improved. If anything, in those 6 hours, the flavors having continued their conversation in the lunchbox while the morning classes happened around them. The 24th forgotten recipe is the one that the decade's budget kitchens made when the budget had been most severely tested. When the shokui had been stretched across an unexpected expense, and what remained for the last 3 days of the week was essentially the pantry's permanent stock rather than its rotating provision. And the permanent stock. In the 1970s, dashi kitchen consisted always of rice and miso, and dried kombu, and dried shiitake and soy sauce, and sesame and a jar of sesame paste, goma dare. And from these things a meal could always be made, had always been made, would always be made as long as these things were in the pantry, which was always, because allowing the pantry's permanent stock to be depleted was not something the dashi kitchen did, the permanent stock being the foundation on which everything else was built, and the foundation being the one thing the budget, however compressed, maintained. Goma dare udon, sesame sauce udon, and made from dried udon noodles boiled in the water that was always boiling for one thing or another in the 1970s kitchen, drained and dressed with the sesame paste, thinned with a little dashi and soy and mirin and rice vinegar and a small amount of the chili oil that the pantry kept in a small bottle. the sauce the color of old ivory and tasting of roasted grain and salt, and the mild, complex bitterness of the sesame, poured over the warm udon and topped with a scatter of green onion and a pour of additional sesame oil, and eaten immediately before the noodles had absorbed the sauce and the sauce had become the noodle. The moment of eating being the moment of the correct ratio of sauce to noodle, the window of this correctness being approximately 4 minutes, set after which the noodles had taken too much, and the dish was still good, but not as good as it had been in the window. The 25th forgotten recipe is not a recipe, but the recipe behind all the recipes, the one that made all 24 before it possible, that made the 10-yen coin on the cutting board into a week of dinners rather than a week of anxiety. The dashi, made every morning from the kombu that had been soaking since the previous evening, the kombu removed and saved for a second use, and the water brought to just below a boil, and the katsuobushi added and steeped for 3 minutes and strained through the cloth, the resulting dashi golden and clear and smelling of the ocean and the mountain simultaneously. The umami compounds it contained being the mechanism by which the 1970s danchi kitchen made a small amount of everything taste like enough of something. Because the dashi was right, the miso soup was right. Because the miso soup was right, the simplest meal was complete. Because the simplest meal was complete, the family sat at the table and ate together, and were nourished and were satisfied. And the 10-yen coin on the cutting board was not the evidence of how little there was, but of how much had been made from it. The coin being not what was missing from the meal, but what was left over after the meal had been provided, which is a different thing entirely, which is the whole point, which is the story that 25 forgotten recipes from a decade of creative necessity have been telling from the beginning. The dashi cloth rinsed and hung to dry. The pot rinsed and returned to the burner. The 10-yen coin moved from the cutting board to the small dish by the door where tomorrow's coins will gather. The smell of soy and mirin rising through the concrete stairwell. Someone, on every floor, making the same dinner at the same hour, in the same small kitchen, with the same careful arithmetic of love and necessity that produces, when it is practiced long enough and well enough, not poverty food, but the food of people who knew exactly what they were doing and did it with everything they had.